Good afternoon, everyone. We're just waiting a few minutes until everyone joins and we'll get the webinar started. For those of you just joining, we're just waiting a few minutes until most of our participants have logged in. So appreciate your patience. Stand by. I still see a few people logging in there, so I'm just going to give it another minute and then we'll start with the presentation. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us here today for our white paper on CCUS here in Newfoundland and Labrador's offshore. I'd like to start off by thanking our project partners, Energy NL, EcoNext, and Oilco for their guidance, support, and leadership in the past year as we've dived into these pathways towards net zero for offshore oil and gas industry. Here's a quick look at our agenda for the next hour, in which our project team will briefly discuss each section of the white paper for your benefit. And just to give you, I guess, a brief overview of our project, the primary objective of this team is to help identify pathways for the Newfoundland and Labrador offshore in order for it to reach net zero. So far, our research has undertaken the net zero pathways for Canada's offshore oil and gas industry and the feasibility of blue hydrogen in the same. Our priorities going forward will include, of course, include CCUS, but also involve the continuation of research into electrification of offshore assets, offsets, and the continued refinement of those net zero pathways. Also seen on the slide presented, this project has been supported with funding from Natural Resource Canada Emissions Reduction Fund, which was managed by the Energy Research Innovation Newfoundland Labrador, ERINL, and the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, along with the government of Newfoundland and Labrador. So we appreciate that support as well. Before we begin, a reminder that at the end, we'll be having a short question and answer. So if you have any questions throughout, there is a section there in the webinar for you to provide questions. There's also a comment feature there as well to put anything that isn't, I guess, required as a question. Also, to address the PowerPoint presentation, we will distribute it to all the attendees after this presentation, and the actual white paper itself will be delivered shortly thereafter, post-webinar review. We'll go through the questions and answers and the comments and make sure if there's anything in there that is pertinent to the white paper that we included or revised. So we appreciate that, and we'll get started. As previously mentioned, the overarching objective of our project is to pursue that energy resilience aimed at ensuring the long-term sustainable future of Canada's growing offshore oil and gas industry, particularly here in Newfoundland and Labrador, by embracing a lower emissions future in line with provincial and national objectives of achieving that by 2050. We recognize, as do many in the industry and within government, that the future holds no single solution to meet net zero requirements. In recognition of this, and based on our research to date, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or CCUS, is increasingly becoming a realistic option for reducing CO2 emissions and will be essential to achieving the goal of those net zero emissions by 2050 and the goals before that. You can see here that in relation to Canada's total emissions, the percentage contributed to that from the offshore oil and gas industry here in the province is quite minimal when compared to the full extent. This is already due to low emitting facilities and the work being conducted by operators to minimize emissions in their current state. Something that puts us in a rare position of envy amongst many offshore oil and even onshore oil producing industries. CCUS has emerged as a very important area of interest from the perspectives of brownfield, greenfield, and mass storage in a hub concept. Building on the success of our recently held CCUS workshop in September of last year, the project is focusing on related action items and facilitating that collaboration with various stakeholders in this technology. Continued economic modeling, enabling and restricting policy investigation, and technical feasibility analysis will help inform priorities in this regard. This area presents an opportunity for the development of and investment attraction for a major innovation project. So with this in mind, it is our purpose of this paper to provide awareness of CCUS and continue that stakeholder engagement on this very important and transformational pathway. I will now pass this presentation over to our technical lead and the lead for this paper, Peter Bennett, as he brings us through a discussion on capture technologies and transportation. Peter?
Okay, thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. CCUS technology, or it's sometimes abbreviated to CCS when CO2 is only stored and not utilized, it's proven and has existed for decades. It's already in use around the world and in Canada, such as the Boundary Dam project in Weyburn, Saskatchewan, and the Quest project in Edmonton, Alberta. It is used primarily in onshore industries, such as power generation, cement, and steel making. As can be seen in the illustration, the process involves capturing CO2 emissions that come from a plant or industrial site and stops them from being released into the atmosphere. The captured emissions are then transported and stored underground in deep geological formations, typically 1 kilometer or more below the surface. CCS is critical to meeting the country's long-term energy needs and climate goals. The International Energy Agency and other sources have stated that without substantial support to further develop and employ CCS technology, it will be difficult for Canada and the rest of the world to meet its emission reduction targets. The selection of technology is dependent on many factors, including speed of application, cost, and effectiveness, to name a few. The illustration shows 3 examples of capture technology: pre-combustion carbon capture, post-combustion carbon capture, and oxy-fuel combustion carbon capture, which all prevent carbon from entering the atmosphere. There are other carbon negative capture technologies, such as direct air capture and reforestation, as a couple of examples. They could be utilized for removing CO2 directly from the atmosphere. Eventually, they may complement efforts to achieve net zero carbon emissions, but our focus here is how to prevent CO2 from entering the atmosphere during combustion of natural gas in the turbines during oil production offshore. In the Newfoundland offshore, where space and weight are at a premium, the process that is least complicated, requires less energy, and involves minimal equipment installation may be the favored approach. However, the least complicated process may be the least efficient at capturing carbon. Therefore, trade-offs between cost, efficiency, and space constraints need to be evaluated. So let's review the capture technologies. During pre-combustion carbon capture, CO2 is removed from the fuel prior to combustion. This is done by converting the fuel, typically natural gas, into a hydrogen fuel. Burning hydrogen gives off no emissions, only water. In most cases, the turbines can only burn a blend of hydrogen and natural gas. So the type of turbine you have is important, and it may require upgrading the turbine on a brownfield facility, for example, to allow greater hydrogen utilization. The process is complicated and involves using steam methane reforming, which uses a lot of energy. In addition, the storage and handling of hydrogen is challenging, especially offshore. Oxy-fuel combustion carbon capture uses pure oxygen rather than air for combustion of fuel. When oxygen is used in combustion rather than air, it produces exhaust gas that is mainly water vapor and CO2 that can be easily separated to produce a high purity CO2 stream, which is important if you're trying to remove as much CO2 as possible. The process, however, involves installing air separation equipment in front of the turbines, which is an added cost and takes more space and adds weight. Post-combustion carbon capture is emerging as a key technology focus area for from the near to medium term, and appears to have the best chance of being successfully applied to Newfoundland offshore. It involves capturing carbon after combustion when CO2 is more concentrated in the flue gas. It is the least complicated and likely the lowest cost option. Typically, amine solvents are used extensively in post-combustion carbon capture in the onshore industries. In the offshore oil and gas industries, amine plants are very rare, and to date, none are used to capture carbon from turbine exhaust. The technologies that enable post-combustion carbon capture are evolving. As the world's ambition to lower emissions increase, considerable research and development into better and more cost-effective capture technologies are underway. The Government of Canada is investing significantly to incentivize research, development, and demonstrations to advance the commercial viability of these technologies. So let's review some of the emerging technologies that hold some promise for offshore Newfoundland. The figure on the top left shows Aker Carbon Capture's Just Catch Offshore module. Aker solution has recently been qualified by DNV and is now ready to be deployed in the offshore. The solution is based on a modularized design with multiple capacity options. It does, however, use amine solvent for capturing CO2. On the top right, a local company, MA ProSense Inc., along with Secor, has progressed the first phase of a comprehensive research project exploring a compact solution for carbon capture offshore Newfoundland. They are investigating the use of supersonic nozzles to separate CO2 from offshore turbine exhaust flue gases. Also, there are emerging post-combustion carbon capture technologies that use very small solid adsorbent materials similar to filters that can remove CO2 without any or minimal amine solvents. These new types of nanomaterials have the potential to transform carbon capture. Dr. Michael Katz from Memorial University is exploring materials that can separate CO2 from other gases by allowing it to pass through the material's pores, but restricting and catching larger molecules such as nitrogen and methane. On the bottom left, a Canadian company, Savante, has developed a metal organic framework, or MOF, that can selectively catch and release CO2. On the bottom right, another developing technology that may be suitable for offshore Newfoundland uses a combination of amines and rotating pack beds to capture carbon more efficiently than just using amines alone. This allows a more compact design with smaller equipment requiring less space. These emerging technologies are not considered ready for normal commercial service yet. They typically have lower technology readiness levels and require additional research for wider application. Even though post-combustion carbon capture may be considered the most feasible capture technology option for offshore Newfoundland, it still has many challenges for offshore implementation. From an environmental standpoint, a significant issue with current commercialized post-combustion carbon capture technology is that it introduces potentially new chemicals such as amines into the offshore environment that were not there previously, but are needed for CO2 absorption. On the safety side, the resulting concentrated CO2 from the capture plant will have safety implications for an offshore facility. CO2 is an inert gas and will not present a fire risk to the platform. However, CO2 is toxic at high concentration and will cause asphyxiation if oxygen concentrations are too low. A retrofit of an existing facility will result in a high-cost, large-scale, multi-year project requiring significant engineering, procurement, execution, and commissioning activities. Projects such as this would almost certainly result in a development plan amendment involving the regulator and statutory certification. Downtime and deferred production would need to be considered in the economics of the project. In a retrofit project, a critical balance would need to be found between the target carbon capture efficiency, available space, weight considerations, and electrical power demands. The figure on the slide illustrates how a carbon capture process could theoretically be added to existing facilities like a GBS or an FPSO. Okay, Chris, I'll hand it over to you to do transport.
My apologies, I was on mute. When we talk about transportation, we get to the stage of carbon capture and storage that links the sources and the storage sites. CO2 can be transported in 3 states, either gas, liquid, or solid. Commercial scale transport uses pipelines and or ships for gaseous and liquid carbon dioxide transport. Tanks are sometimes used for temporary storage, as we've recently seen during our visit to the Northern Lights project in Norway. Pipelines routinely carry large volumes of natural gas, oil, condensate, and water over distances of thousands of kilometers, both on land and in the sea. In the context of long-distance movement of large quantities of carbon dioxide, pipeline transport is part of the current practice. Challenges include higher operating pressure and corrosion, however. There is no indication that the problems for carbon dioxide pipelines are any more challenging than those set by hydrocarbon pipelines in other similar areas, or that they cannot be resolved. The properties of liquefied carbon dioxide are not greatly different from those of liquefied petroleum gases, and the technology can be scaled up to large carbon dioxide carriers. Liquefied natural gas and petroleum gases such as propane and butane are routinely transported by marine tankers. Carbon dioxide tankers are constructed using the same technology as existing liquefied gas carriers, and their use in transporting CO2 is currently at a smaller scale because of that limited demand as the industry is starting to develop. Marine transportation systems typically involve that temporary storage on land and a loading facility, as well as the ship itself during that transshipment. This is a good opportunity for us to also mention that as part of the Energy Innovation Program, And Peter mentioned the significant contributions and funding opportunities that the government of Canada is providing the industry. There's a new call under the carbon capture, utilization, and storage for research, development, and demonstration. This aims to characterize and develop safe, permanent subsurface CO2 storage and technologies that support safe and efficient transportation of CO2 and the storage opportunities across Canada. We know that there is a significant focus on the eastern part of the country, particularly around Newfoundland and Labrador. And we think there is some really good opportunities for innovators and stakeholders within our ecosystem to participate. There is the first deadline for this is the expressions of interest, as it's mentioned on the screen, on April 17th of this year. I'll pass you back over to Peter to discuss the hub concept.
Okay, thanks, Chris. In the long term, Newfoundland Offshore shows significant potential to act as a regional or even national storage hub for carbon with storage potential in the gigaton range. More investigation is required, such as the storage assessment being undertaken by OilCo, to better define this opportunity and begin to conceptualize technical and economic design. A storage hub would collect carbon from various sources and after capture and transport would inject the carbon into common infrastructure for permanent geological storage or otherwise provide the carbon for utilization in industry. The figure shows the amount of GHG emissions produced in the Eastern Canadian provinces for the year 2020. There's potential for collaboration among the Eastern Canadian provinces to develop CO2 transport cluster for onshore emitters and a storage hub for offshore Newfoundland, utilizing pipelines and shipping.
Thank you, Peter. And I'm just going to pass you along now to Michelle. Michelle's our innovation lead and in-house expert on all things subsurface, and she'll guide us through an overview of the utilization and storage of CO2. So thank you again, Peter.
Thanks, Chris. Enhanced oil recovery is a term that we often hear, often called EOR. It's an umbrella term, so it does encompass a lot of different things, several different processes. And one of those processes is miscible displacement through gas injection. And in this case, the gas is carbon dioxide. So at supercritical conditions, which are temperatures of 31.1 degrees Celsius and pressures of 7.38 megapascals, carbon dioxide becomes miscible with oil. So it essentially mixes with oil. With the oil and the carbon dioxide mixed in a liquid phase, the pressure increases and the viscosity decreases, therefore it results in an increased mobility of the oil that can move then towards the production well. Often carbon dioxide and water are injected in an alternating pattern, and we can see this in the image on the slide. This is called water alternating gas, or you've often heard it called WAG. It reduces the amount of CO2 required. And in this scenario, the carbon dioxide will still become miscible with oil, and the water increases the pressure and does force the oil towards the production well. So this tertiary recovery mechanism can result in another estimated 15 to 20% of the original oil in place on top of the primary production and secondary production from things like gas or water flooding. CO2 EOR in itself, this is probably important, is not a storage method for carbon dioxide because the carbon dioxide is produced at the surface with the oil. However, if you look at the picture on the slide, if the CO2 is separated and then re-injected, so it stays in a closed loop, it can be considered a storage mechanism. So the Hibernia Enhanced Oil Recovery Laboratory at Memorial University with Dr. Leslie James has partnered with Hibernia amongst other organizations to research EOR opportunities offshore Newfoundland, which include integration of carbon dioxide. If we look at storage piece, the reservoirs offshore Newfoundland and Labrador have always been considered world-class. We hear that often because they have very high porosities and good permeabilities to store hydrocarbons. And it's those same characteristics that actually make them ideal for storing carbon dioxide as well. So similar to a hydrocarbon system, a carbon dioxide storage complex requires three main components. Obviously a reservoir rock with ample porosity, so pore space, and permeability is the connectivity of those pores, which creates storage volume. A cap rock to contain the carbon dioxide from moving vertically, and a trapping mechanism that will prevent it from moving laterally. In the picture on the slide, the carbon dioxide, which in this case is in red, displaces the water that's already in the reservoir, which is in blue, from between the grains of sand, which are brown. While the cap rock, which is in gray, overlying the reservoir, prevents the carbon dioxide from moving vertically. To keep the carbon dioxide from moving laterally, you need a trapping mechanism. A simple and common trap is an anticline, and that's shown in the image on the slide. But there are others. There's stratigraphic traps and fault traps and combination traps. Offshore Newfoundland, we're very lucky here. We have all the main elements required for carbon dioxide storage. We see it with our hydrocarbon opportunities. And it's at different stratigraphic levels, so vertically within the subsurface, as well as within different parts of the sedimentary basin, so from a lateral perspective. And now the previous slide may have made carbon dioxide storage seem pretty simple, but we can't underestimate the technical work that needs to go into determining an ideal storage location. This slide shows an example of site selection criteria. And as you can see, there are many other pieces of the equation that need to be considered, such as the reservoir pressure, or faulting or fracturing of the cap rock, any potential seismicity or seismic events, reservoir depth, and so on. So fulsome subsurface evaluation, which includes lots of disciplines such as geologists, geophysicists, reservoir drilling, completions engineers, and others is required. So to put our reservoirs offshore Newfoundland in context to these selection criteria, the porosities in the producing Jeanne d'Arc reservoirs range from approximately 12 to 20%. So that is certainly over the criteria listed here of greater than 10%. The permeabilities are in the hundreds of millidarcies to the Darcy range, which is again well above the suggested 20 millidarcy ranges on this particular site selection. And the depths are greater than 2 kilometers, which then directly translates to the reservoir temperatures being greater than 60 degrees. Now, keep in mind, these are the oil-bearing reservoirs. However, even the shallower aquifers often meet or exceed the above criteria. To date, the vast storage potential that we have here has not been quantified. However, last fall, Oilco, one of our partners, issued an RFP to assess the carbon dioxide storage potential. That RFP is now closed, and we do hope to see some of the results of the first phase of this project in 2023. After the CO2 has been injected into the reservoir, it is important to monitor the CO2 plume, and we need to make sure that it remains in an acceptable area and acceptable pressure so that it does not compromise the storage complex and subsequently escape. So permanence is very important. Developing and executing these MMVs, or monitoring, measurement, and verification plans, will be a requirement for any project, carbon dioxide project offshore Newfoundland. Several standards and best practice already exist. That's the good part. Canadian Standards Association, the U.S. Department of Energy, DNV, Alberta Department of Energy, and the International Organization for Standardization are just some examples of the organizations that have published standards and best practices. So there is an opportunity for Newfoundland and Labrador to utilize existing standards and practices, or modify slightly, and not have to start from square one. The techniques that can be used to monitor CO2 are the same techniques that are used in the discovery and production of oil and gas reservoirs. So in the table above, you can see that there are several categories of subsurface techniques that are applicable to both monitoring of carbon dioxide and offshore petroleum exploration and development. And luckily, the Newfoundland oil and gas industry has decades of experience using these techniques, such as 4D seismic, for example.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for that very detailed and informative look at how our industry can utilize CO2 to enhance oil recovery offshore, and how our jurisdiction and offshore geological formations show the massive potential for carbon storage. I'm now going to bring you through the regulations and policy section of our white paper. So when while the need for CCUS projects and the policy direction of governments are somewhat clear, there are currently no regulatory frameworks in place for the implementation of CCUS projects in Canada's offshore. The regulation of offshore air emissions fall under provincial jurisdiction, while the storage of CO2 in the offshore would occur on federal lands under federal jurisdiction. Offshore CCUS projects are therefore the ideal scope to be regulated by the CNLPB as a joint federal provincial regulatory body, similar to our oil and gas operations. There is some potential under existing legislation that the board, as our offshore regulator, may consider an application for an amendment to an existing authorization if an operator proposed injection of CO2 into an oil-producing geological formation. There would be several conditions that must be met, such as capacity, monitoring, and future development plans. Approval may be possible under these existing processes. Within the context of this paper, it is important to recognize the distinction between gas storage for future development and permanent storage for CO2 associated with CCS. This paper presents an overlook of the regulatory context associated with long-term ownership of a dedicated carbon storage site and the continuation of monitoring and surveillance past the life of a hydrocarbon production project. As part of the London Protocol, an international agreement intended to prevent waste disposals at sea, Canada has a disposal at sea regime administered by Environment and Climate Change Canada under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, or CEPA. CEPA currently does not allow subsea CO2 storage in Canadian waters and prohibits the import and export of CO2 destined for subsea bed storage, which would require amendments to add CO2 to approve this of substances. There have been several amendments to this UN protocol over the last 15 years to allow for storage and transportation of CO2, but in Canada, changes to CEPA are required in order to adopt these amendments, in order to add CO2 to that list of approved substances under the ocean disposal regulations. It is important to note that although CCS projects are not explicitly listed as a designated project requiring a federal impact assessment, if a proposed CCS project were to use existing oil and gas infrastructure, there is room for interpretation. Sections of the physical activities regulations will require this interpretation as they relate to an offshore CCS project, namely around the decommissioning and abandonment of existing installations and the sections that are already related to pipelines in the offshore. Specifically, if existing offshore platforms were converted for the purposes of CO2 injection, and if the pipelines were repurposed or constructed to carry CO2 for the purposes of reinjection and storage, they would not be considered a designated project. Governments could consider a new mechanism to review projects that are offering to capture and store emissions by excluding CCUS-related projects from requiring assessment under the Impact Assessment Act. Presumably, if a new well were required for CO2 injection, it also may be excluded from a requirement under the Impact Assessment Act. Once there is a clear path to a federal approval for CCS projects in the offshore, Newfoundland provincial regulations and or guidance surrounding operation and decommissioning of CCS projects will be required. To the advantage of the province, there are relevant examples within Canada that can provide guidance, namely the work being done in Alberta. For example, Alberta's amended several acts governing the oil and gas industry and had three main objectives of those amendments. One was to clarify the ownership of that pore space. Two, to transfer to the province long-term liability for injected CO2. And three, to create a stewardship fund to be used for remedial work and the ongoing monitoring costs for the CO2 post-operation. This gave Alberta ownership of pore space in province and therefore took on the long-term liability of stored CO2 once the site is no longer active. And they will be responsible for assuring that any leaks are fixed and the wellbores are maintained. These amendments also allow the government to make it mandatory for carbon capture and storage operators to contribute to the post-closure stewardship fund. The government of Alberta will use that fund for ongoing monitoring and any required maintenance and remediation. Further to this, land tenure for carbon sequestration in Alberta is issued through a competitive bid process to projects not associated with oil and gas extraction. The intent is to award licenses to hubs or cluster projects, where CO2 is collected from multiple facilities and injected underground. This is based on their onshore development models and would not necessarily work for the same in offshore Newfoundland on an asset basis, but would prevent relevant information on the process should a hub concept be considered. Finally, a CCUS operator will be responsible for the CCS operation until it substantiates that stored carbon dioxide is contained and a closure certificate has been issued. However, in this case, the Alberta government will be the owner, and the sequestered CO2 on an indefinite basis will assume the monitoring and other post-closure responsibilities. We have also seen similar arrangements in other jurisdictions, such as Norway, who are dealing with an industry more similar to our own offshore. Credit issuance is a significant incentive and means to create more value in emissions reduction efforts. Credits can be the tipping point that makes a project feasible and therefore a key factor in attracting project investment. Our economic lead, Stephen Golding, will touch on these in the next section, but we know that under the right conditions, credit-based revenues support a case to attract private investment to execute emission reduction projects, which would otherwise not be feasible. However, in the absence of price certainty within each of these credit examples, there is inherent risk in using the projected value of credits in any economic model. When we talk about offset credits, we are talking about credits that are generated by preventing or removing GHG emissions from the atmosphere over and above business as usual or legal requirements to reduce GHGs. When we consider credits created by CCS, there are no current plans for a CCS protocol for industrial emissions. A regulated facility may explore the option of producing offset credits for the voluntary market, although the uncertainty of credit price and the risk of low demand would increase compared to the regulated offset market. Here in Newfoundland and Labrador, we hear a lot about performance credits, where emissions reduction beyond regulatory requirements for offshore facilities will currently earn performance credits under the provincial management of greenhouse gas regulations. A CCUS project on an offshore installation would potentially introduce hundreds of thousands of additional credits into a market with a limited number of potential buyers. With this in mind, the province is proposing a minimum pricing structure for credits created by Newfoundland Labrador Hydro, which would then likely translate to credits produced by all other facilities. With this, though, there comes the upcoming delivery on what the offshore emissions cap will go, and how current discussions show that the performance credits may no longer be available to offshore oil and gas facilities. However, there is no timeline for the potential phasing out of this system. In the absence of an option to use performance credits or offset credits for compliance, offshore operators will be left with a choice between direct emissions reduction or paying into the provincial greenhouse gas reduction fund at the federal carbon price per ton of emissions. On the capital investment side, we have the investment tax credit, where currently the government of Canada is offering tax credits for eligible captured equipment and transportation storage and use equipment. Enhanced oil recovery projects are not eligible at this time. Each of these CCUS tax credits are only to be available to projects and jurisdictions where there are sufficient regulations to ensure that CO2 is permanently stored as determined by ECC. And unfortunately, Newfoundland does not currently qualify. Within the white paper, we have outlined what conditions must be met prior to being approved for this ITC. And finally, we have clean fuel credits, which are similar to the qualification requirements for the ITC, where CCUS projects are required to demonstrate existing provincial regulations to ensure permanent storage in order to earn credits under the clean fuel regulations. The Minister of Environment and Climate Change may decline projects in this province if it cannot be demonstrated they have relevant regulations to ensure permanent storage. This includes, but is not limited to, requirements for site characterization, well construction and operation, injection monitoring, and well abandonment. When we talk about regulatory gaps, and as alluded to before, other than the board's approval of gas injection by an operator on an existing production license, Canada does not have a regulatory framework for offshore CCS or ocean-based CO2 sequestration. There are no statutes available to grant interest on the continental shelf for activities unrelated to oil and gas development outside a waste disposal site under the disposal at sea regulations. In terms of satisfying the ITC and CFR credit requirements, as mentioned in the previous slide, it is necessary to work with the province and the CNLPB to identify where gaps in regulations may exist. The discrepancy between gas storage for future use and permanent CO2 gas storage may be bridged with existing standards and guidance. In this regard, there is work currently ongoing that could help with these efforts. For example, the CSA group have developed a standardized approach for geological carbon storage projects that are consistent with industry best practices and in regulatory requirements that could form the basis of a regulatory framework for offshore carbon storage. Together, using these CSA or other internationally recognized standards, such as recommended practices from class societies like DNV and Lloyd's, while using similar quantification methods as seen as other jurisdictions, could form the base of a regulatory framework for offshore carbon storage in this province. The use of international standards on CCUS for alignment cannot be overstated and could drastically improve confidence for industry and investors on a global CCUS market. The International Organization for Standardization is currently developing these types of standards for this purpose in all aspects of CCUS. I'll now pass you over to Steve Golding, our economics lead, to guide you through our economics section for this paper. And thank you very much, Stephen. Go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon, folks. Thanks again for taking the time out of your day and getting away from cleaning your driveways to join us in this webinar. Thank you as well to my colleagues whose understanding of the technical and regulatory aspects of this business is far greater than mine. So my role here is to take all their good work and put some numbers around it and see if how it looks going forward for us. I'm going to look at some of the high-level factors and the underlying factors within this industry that make it unique, and what does it mean for us here in the province. Next, please. So what exactly makes CCUS uniquely challenging in terms of a business? I've built cash flow and economic models for over 25 years for businesses of all sizes, ranging from small mom and pop tourist shops to some of the largest resource projects in the province. And while the underlying businesses and number of digits may be different, the basics are the same. We take the best information we have, we forecast our revenues, production, capital costs, schedules, operating costs, taxes, royalties, etc., financing costs. We put it all together, and then we do things that measure things like rates of return, internal rate of return, return on equity, all that good stuff. Probably more importantly, though, is we look at, by doing a model, you can kind of look at things that are the key drivers and what are the key factors that we can control or can't control that can drive the viability of a project. Some of the other challenges here related to CCS is it's quite a different business concept, I guess, in terms of selling a product. Normally, a project would involve, say, a resource project extraction of commodities, selling those commodities on an open market with established prices. Yes, the prices are volatile, they change, but there is an established market for that. CCS, however, involves the permanent storage of carbon, and the market value is derived primarily from the avoidance of paying carbon taxes and other fees. So while we can approximate a market value as through a carbon tax or some kind of emissions trading scheme like a cap and trade, for example, there still remains uncertainty for several reasons. First instance, these markets are relatively new, constantly evolving. Probably the most important one, though, is that many of the market price signals are sent by government policy, which varies throughout the world, and as we know, can and do change sometimes without warning. Finally, there's the added factor of the importance of ESG and how do operators value ESG. So it might need to be pure rates of return economics. There's a little bit of a softer kind of component to that as well. So some of the other differences and unique challenges of CCUS, as my colleagues discussed, about the high capital costs offshore, limited market here locally. We still need our storage potential to be determined in the regulatory regime. And the investment tax credits, as Chris mentioned, we're still not eligible for them here. So in summary, though, I mean, there is uncertainty. I guess any business has that, but CCS, I think, is here to stay. It's going to be a big part of the carbon decarbonization efforts in the world. and we just need to understand it and see what we can do here in Newfoundland. Next. So just to give you an idea on where the carbon pricing system are in the world, I found this chart here from the IMF report from last summer. So this shows the 36 different countries, that's all is only, or 46 countries actually price carbon. They're typically through one of three methods: a carbon tax, an emissions trading scheme like a cap and trade, or a hybrid. As you can see in this graph, the green dots are the hybrid system, the emission trading systems are the blue, and the carbon tax is the yellow. So what this graph shows us is going across the horizontal axis is the percent of greenhouse gases covered by area, and going up is the price. So as you can see, the coverage ranges from the bottom left corner. We got the US at less than 5% of their emissions at a price of $20, $30 a ton, ranging from countries like Iceland, which almost covers 100% of their emissions with a price of 60-ish, and you have some prices over 100. I guess the point being, it's all over the place. And I guarantee you in 2 years' time, this chart will be different again. So right now, about 30% of the global emissions are covered, which is an inherent problem itself. It's not like oil is sold on a global market. 100% of the oil is covered. 30% of the emissions are covered, so that lends a different element as well. And as you can see on the graph, prices range here from $5 to about $100 a ton, and the global average, including the emissions that aren't covered, is about $6. And then even within Canada, because we're a localist market, you think, okay, Canada must be a little bit better. Next slide, please, Chris. So this is again from a couple of years ago, I think, and this shows the varying systems just within Canada, let alone the world. You see there's a mix. The dark blue, I won't get into all the nuances of the different provinces and federal structures, but I guess the point being is that it is quite varying across, again, just within Canada, let alone the world. So Newfoundland, we have a performance credit system, which I think Chris touched on for the most part. Basically, there's a couple inherent issues or dynamics of that market. Is there's about 13 to 15 emitters that have to report every year and that are required to reduce based on their historical emissions. So I think the 2016 to 18 timeframe. And if they meet the targets, they get performance credits. If they exceed them, they can purchase them in the market or pay into a fund. One of the problems, it sounds great, but we have 13 people, so there's a very limited market. One other wrinkle is Holyrood, because of that's being reduced considerably once we get the Muskrat Falls working a little better, that there will be a lot of credits going forward. So that puts a kind of as opposed to actually reducing emissions, there's an option to buy credits. Now, Hydro has put in place up to this point, I think, a floor on the price of 20% below the carbon price, and I believe that might be going down to 10, I think, going forward. Again, the uncertainty, it's still in flux, and another element of that, and you'll hear me saying uncertainty quite a bit here. The federal government's emission reduction plan proposal, there was some concern that we wouldn't be meeting it with our structure here, but right now we are. So the performance credit system will stay in place until the next review in 3 years' time. Again, 3 years' time is a very short window for making big capital investments in these type of things. So it's, again, uncertainty has a cost. That's about it for that one, I think. Next slide, please, Chris. Okay. So in our research, we kind of looked through search and literature on what are the costs, and we put some together in this table, and as you can see, it's quite a range. So the best way to look at it is the three components of the carbon capture. One is the capture, of course, which in general seems to be the highest component of the cost. And the carbon, that's very, Hibernia is going to do their thing with their carbon capture. A cement plant will do their thing. Come by chance would do theirs. So that's there's not much we really can do, I guess, as to help that. They're going to do that or not based on their how they value it. So Transportation and storage, as you see, they're a little less cost, lower cost than the capture. And transport, of course, is going to depend on whether it's a pipeline or a ship, how far you are away, the volumes you can transport. If you can transport more per unit, the unit costs come down. And then the storage, which seems to have the lowest and least variable type costs, is based on the qualities of your storage reservoir. Do you have how many wells you can put in there? Where is it? Is it onshore? Is it offshore? And again, volumes is very important because you spread your costs over your total volume. So anyway, from Newfoundland, I guess in terms of business development or looking at the value chain that we can capture here, the capture side again is going to be done by the operator generally. Transport and storage, there might be some possibilities there from the hub concept. If you can provide a service, say for in Eastern Canada, I believe you'll see in the white paper, we've looked at some of the emitters in Eastern Canada, that if that storage is proven and we have lots of room and some ships, maybe there's an opportunity there to focus on that end of the value chain. Again, a lot more work needs to be done. We need to get our regulations in place for offshore storage, the transport side of it, and the technical side as well. So it's a work in progress, but on a first blush through this, it looks like those are the kind of areas that could be benefit from here. Next slide, please, Chris. So what we did, we tried to look at some costing, and now these costs are not definitive. This is a very moving target as we speak. But as part of our pathways report, we looked at, which would be the first column in this chart, is the base case. So what we looked at was what would it cost to put on one unit, an offshore platform to take care of one of the turbines and the emissions, obviously, that come from that. And we looked at the capital costs, the transportation costs, the storage costs, and we came up with a present value of the cost. And then you look at how much carbon can be abated, and you discount that back to present dollars as well, and that gives you a cost per ton of carbon abated. Again, because the price is so uncertain, we need to look at the cost side and do the carbon taxes or other penalties meet that threshold. So I wouldn't put too much stock into exact numbers. It's more the directional changes. What we looked at in our base case was this here. It's about 240, 250 per ton. So then we said, well, what if we're applicable for the investment tax credit, Chris had mentioned? The investment tax credit was brought in last year, provides companies with a 30% refundable tax credit. So essentially the federal government is paying 30% of your capital costs. And what will that do to our kind of straw man base case? And as you can see, it lowered the LTCA quite a bit. During that analysis, we also became aware of the U.S. and their Inflation Reduction Act, which also is encouraging carbon capture investment. And the U.S., as opposed to an investment tax credit against your capital cost, actually pays production credits, they call them. They will pay up $85 a ton, I believe, for capturing carbon. As you can see, that directional benefit is a bit higher than the Canadian one. We just did a couple other scenarios as well. How can the province, if the province wanted to promote this industry, we said, well, what if they deducted the capital carbon capture cost against royalties? Now there's no direction. We're not recommending to do this. It was just something. Well, what could that do to the economics? And as you see, it has a pretty significant benefit to the overall costs. Again, it depends on the royalty with the project. They have different schemes. I think I used an average kind of royalty for them. In scenario 4, I said, well, how dependent is this on capital costs? And I think I bumped the capital costs up again. I'm not exactly saying 25%, and you'll see it really drove up the costs. So that's a big area to risk because the capital costs and these things are still, in flux. And then the last one, we looked at what would a hub concept do if we took, and the big factor in a hub concept, of course, is having more volumes, spreading out the costs over more tons of carbon, and that has a significant, big impact in the overall cost of this. So that's kind of where we're thinking is going next. I think that's good for that one. So finally, what do we do here? How do we capture this? How do we improve the viability of something? Is there anything here? The first one is technology. Of course, we have to keep on top of that, and that changes, and there could be some big game changers that could really drop costs down. Who knows? We just need to stay on top of that. Collaboration, operators, regulators, contractors, government, folks like us, just working together and seeing if we can share some of the costs, share information, share ideas, things like that. Storage, we mentioned that several times, that to getting that assessment done so we know exactly what we have, very important. Economies of scale, similar collaboration, the shared hub concept we talked about that. Again, we don't have a lot of emitters here, but in Eastern North America, Eastern Canada alone, there could be enough there. Again, depending on if they're going to capture, of course, and you would develop a market there. And finally, government support with the tax credits and intangible regulatory certainty and just support for the industry in general. And I think that's it. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That was an extremely valuable overview of the economics around CCUS in this province and in the offshore, and how we look at the potential in the future, and those scenarios that you presented were quite well done. So thank you very much for that. So just before we're coming to an end here now, just to go through some of our project next steps. We will be continuing collaboration with stakeholders in all areas of CCUS and over the other pathways, which many of you on the call are also involved with. We do have more investigation to do to provide better definition and help develop a strategy for our offshore here in the province regarding this technology. We're going to assist with that evaluation and delivery with the CO2 storage assessment as initiated by our project partner OilCo. As Michelle mentioned earlier, we're currently in phase 1 of a 3-phase process. So there'll be additional RFPs coming out on that. So we're very excited about the information that we gathered and the resulting understanding of the storage potential offshore Newfoundland, Labrador. And of course, we're going to develop a roadmap articulating the actions, including the prioritization and sequence to realize our potential, both provincially and how it relates to the federal side as well, potentially also regionally as related to offshore CCUS. So we're now coming to the question and answer period. We're doing pretty good on time. We have just around 10 minutes left to talk about some questions you might have. There has been a few come through, so thank you very much for those that have submitted them. So I do have one here. It's around the regulatory framework in Alberta and how they monitor and measure CO2 storage. So I guess I'll take this one. I guess when we do talk about the monitoring and measuring of CO2 storage, particularly in that example we talked about in Alberta as guidance for our upcoming or future regulatory framework here in Newfoundland. Obviously, they're onshore, we're offshore. So they do subsurface. So they do monitor the movement of CO2 in the storage site and stability of the caprock. But I think through their controls that they put in place, obviously may not bode well for offshore. They monitor soil, well water, and groundwater to ensure it's not leaking, so which will potentially not apply in offshore. And of course, atmospheric, which will not apply, but they monitor CO2 levels in the air. But when it comes to us here in Newfoundland and Labrador and in our offshore, we need to look at we need to look at jurisdictions that are also doing this type of offshore CO2 storage. So obviously Norway always comes to mind, but other areas as well in the UK. But we did, we visited the Northern Lights project later on last fall, and we did discuss this, and we did note that they employ close monitoring, which uses seismic data to refine theoretical models and check that the CO2 is moving within the rock space as expected. So I think this is known as plume migration, and I'm getting into Michelle's area expertise, but in any case, they do monitor this. There is a prescribed data collection and seismic activity that is that will be part of their agreements, part of the CO2 capture and storage operator with the government, and that'll be done over time at agreed time intervals, and that will determine any action, if necessary, post capture and post completion. to the point where if no movement is seen, that they may just consider it abandoned and clear. So that's I hope that answers that question. Another question here around tax incentives to encourage CCS investment. There's a couple here on this. So this would be for Stephen. For what tax incentives are in place to encourage investment? And there was one, you can tie this in. Are there any tax rewards in Canada to receive carbon from a third party for sequestration? And I think we know the answer to that, but I'll leave it to Stephen to answer that. Stephen?
Yeah, sorry about that. My lovely face up there. Okay. The question was the sequestering of carbon from outside of Canada, I think was the question. That is actually one of my questions. If we did just the storage and transportation infrastructure here, would that account for the credits? And if you had a U.S. credit, for example, from a U.S. emitter, is there a share that would come here? Not 100% sure on that one yet, but it's certainly something we'll look at. Was there another one, Chris?
Yep. Well, what other tax incentives are in place to encourage CCS investment?
What other tax incentives? Well, mainly it's the investment tax credit, which is still not applicable for Newfoundland, to be clear. That's only Alberta so far, out west. Other than that, there's no tax credit that I am aware of in Canada that would help this.
Okay. All right.
That is a big one.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Stephen. This one's for Peter. Given what you presented there in your presentation on the technical side, what are the key technical challenges with CCS in offshore Newfoundland? Peter?
Okay, thanks, Chris. I'd say, as I said in the presentation, space and weight are definitely some of the key challenges. The commercially available technologies for post-combustion carbon capture, if you applied them, it would mean you're essentially installing a gas plant offshore. So I guess, there's no wonder there, it hasn't been done previously for turbine exhaust gases. Current offshore oil production is relatively straightforward, and offshore Newfoundland, it's from a process perspective, you're relying on gravity separation of gas, oil, water, basically. But when you add a gas processing plant with an amine absorption tower, a deabsorber tower, and all the ancillary equipment that goes with it, it makes the process complicated, not only just for installation, but operations as well. So I think a better solution, eventually some of these emerging technologies would, with the smaller footprint and less complicated operations would be key to for implementing post-combustion carbon capture offshore.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Peter. I think that answered that question. I got another question here, which I guess compliments the entire team. Everyone that gets a chance to answer. This actually has come up before and was one of our questions during our visit up the Northern Lights and with other stakeholders that are involved with with carbon storage offshore. Can you use existing wells for CO2 injection? So Michelle, I think this would be in your space.
Thanks. I probably should preface this with saying that I'm not into drilling and completions, but it's a great question, and we've had a lot of conversations about this. But I guess one of the things to think about is the well placement. Anyone who's been involved in offshore development when it comes to oil and gas production recognizes the importance of well location and what that will look like on the movement of fluids in the subsurface. So the likelihood that you have an existing well that is in the best possible location for carbon dioxide storage is probably pretty low. Not impossible, but probably pretty low. Also have to think about like exposure to carbon dioxide. There's going to have a significant more amount of corrosion. And so I think I was reading one reference that suggests that, your casing sections, sand control screens, urine well tubulars, they need to be like 13 or 25% chromium steel, which is going to be significantly more expensive. And of course, there's going to be a substantial long lead turnaround time on that. And I imagine the same thing will go for packers and seals. Cement is another piece. Obviously, carbon dioxide would have a different reaction with cements than hydrocarbons. So I guess the short answer is yes, probably, but not without a significant amount of rework. And there is some studies going on in this space, and I believe that this would qualify under some of the R&D through the NRCan EOI CCUS call that's open right now. So if anyone has potential solutions, this might be a great time to progress them. But it's probably easier to just drill a new well in an optimal location with materials that are to spec for carbon dioxide injection. I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. And I guess for context, Northern Lights project, that was the route that they took as well. They took new wells being drilled, less risk involved. I believe it was their paramount reason. Now I'm just looking at the time here. We are a couple minutes over, and I'm looking at the participant levels, and they're starting to go because people have other scheduled activities or work commitments. So I'm gonna hold it there for the questions. I know that there's still a couple there, and I want to give you confidence that we'll look at them, and I'll try to answer them outside of this webinar. But I do appreciate the amount of feedback we have received, and for the amount of participants that attended today. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much for attending. As mentioned previously, we will send out this presentation. I'll send it out now shortly after this we get off the call. As for the white paper, we'll have that distributed in short order once we review some of these questions that came through and make sure that we can, if possible, we can elaborate further in our white paper as we progress that. It's also worthy to note that this white paper is what we consider evergreen. We consider that we'll be making revisions to this as our project and this technology progresses in this jurisdiction, and we look forward to any inputs that you as the essential stakeholders in this province have on this technology and how to progress it forward. So again, thank you very much, and have a great day.